I stood outside that small florist shop for nearly 10 minutes before finding the courage to walk in, fully prepared to see the woman I'd once loved standing behind the counter with a wedding ring on her finger and someone else's last name. But the moment she looked up and saw me, before I could say a single word of the apology I'd rehearsed for 3 years, she simply said, "I kept your seat empty at every Sunday dinner," and everything I thought I understood about my own future collapsed and rebuilt itself in the space of that one sentence. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness and second chances, take a moment to like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Kindness Inspire, because this story is about to remind you that sometimes the people we least expect to wait for us are the ones who never stopped. My name is Barnaby Thistlewood, 38 years old, and 3 years earlier I had made what I still consider the single worst decision of my adult life. I left a woman named Wilhelmina Castellane 2 weeks before our wedding, not because I'd stopped loving her, but because I'd let a promotion at my engineering firm convince me that relocating across the country for a career opportunity mattered more than the life we'd spent 4 years building together. I told myself, at the time, that I was doing the responsible thing, the practical thing, that Wilhelmina would understand once the initial hurt faded, that our love was strong enough to survive distance and time apart while I established myself professionally. I was wrong about almost all of it, and the worst part is that some quiet, honest part of me had known I was wrong even as I packed my bags and watched her face crumble in the doorway of the apartment we'd shared. The 3 years that followed were, by most external measures, professionally successful. I took the position at a firm in a city 1,100 miles from everything I'd known, climbed steadily through its ranks, built a reputation as someone reliable and competent, the kind of engineer clients specifically requested for complicated infrastructure projects. But privately, those same 3 years unfolded as a slow, grinding erosion of everything I'd once believed about myself. I dated occasionally, half-heartedly, relationships that never lasted more than a few months because I found myself comparing every woman I met to a person I'd deliberately walked away from, which felt both deeply unfair to them and deeply confusing to me. I called my mother more often than I probably should have at my age, and she, in her quiet way, never once said, "I told you so," though I suspected she thought it every single time I mentioned feeling unmoored. It was my younger sister, Persimmon, who finally forced the conversation I'd been avoiding for 3 years. She'd stayed close with Wilhelmina after the breakup, the two of them having become genuine friends independent of my role in either of their lives, and during a visit home for our father's 60th birthday, she mentioned, almost in passing while we did dishes together, that Wilhelmina had opened her own small flower shop downtown, that she seemed to be doing well, building something entirely her own after the wreckage I'd left behind. I asked, carefully, trying to sound more casual than I felt, whether Wilhelmina had moved on, whether there was someone else in her life now. Persimmon studied me for a long moment before answering honestly that she genuinely didn't know, that Wilhelmina had become quietly private about her personal life in a way she hadn't been before, guarding pieces of herself that she'd once shared freely. That conversation lodged itself somewhere in my chest and refused to leave. I spent the following 2 weeks unable to concentrate properly at work, running through scenario after scenario in my mind, wondering what I would even say if I saw her again, wondering whether 3 years of silence had erased any possibility of an honest conversation, let alone anything more. I finally admitted to myself, lying awake at 2 in the morning in an apartment that had never once felt like home despite 3 years of living in it, that I needed to see her, regardless of what I found, because the alternative was continuing to build an entire life around the absence of someone I'd never properly grieved because I'd never allowed myself to fully accept what I'd lost. I requested time off work, the first real vacation I'd taken in over 2 years, and flew back to my hometown without telling anyone except Persimmon, who reluctantly gave me the address of Wilhelmina's flower shop after making me promise, repeatedly, that I wasn't flying back simply to disrupt whatever peace she'd built for herself. I told my sister honestly that I didn't know what I was hoping to accomplish, only that I needed to see her, needed to finally say the things I should have said 3 years earlier instead of packing boxes while she watched from the doorway with an expression I still saw sometimes when I closed my eyes. The shop itself was smaller than I'd imagined, tucked between a bakery and a second-hand bookstore on a quiet street I remembered from years of walking together during our old relationship. Through the front window, I could see buckets of fresh flowers arranged with obvious care, hand-lettered signs describing seasonal arrangements, and warm daylight spilling generously across the wooden floor inside. I stood outside for nearly 10 minutes, rehearsing an apology that felt increasingly inadequate the longer I stood there, watching customers come and go through the door, unable to make myself walk through it despite having traveled 1,100 miles specifically for this moment. When I finally pushed the door open, the small bell above it announcing my arrival, Wilhelmina was arranging a bouquet of white ranunculus at the counter, her dark hair pulled back in the same loose, practical style she'd always worn while working, and when she looked up and saw me standing in her doorway, her hands went completely still around the stems she was holding. I opened my mouth to begin the apology I'd spent 3 years constructing and immediately failed to say a single word of it, because before I could speak, she set down the flowers, looked directly at me with an expression I couldn't fully read, and said, quietly but without a single trace of hesitation, that she had kept my seat empty at every Sunday dinner with her family for the past 3 years, unable to explain to anyone, including herself, why she couldn't bring herself to let someone else occupy the space where I used to sit. I stood frozen in her doorway, completely unprepared for those words, having spent 3 years building elaborate scenarios in my mind where she'd moved on entirely, married someone steadier and more reliable than I'd proven myself to be, built a life that had no remaining space for me in it whatsoever. Instead, I was standing across from a woman who had apparently spent 3 years holding open a door I'd been too cowardly to walk back through, and the realization hit me with a force that nearly buckled my knees. If this story is touching your heart right now, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment sharing your thoughts, because what happens next reminds us that love, when it's real, has a way of waiting far longer than we ever deserve. We talked for nearly 4 hours that afternoon, sitting on 2 mismatched stools behind her counter while occasional customers came and went, Wilhelmina attending to them with the same warm competence I remembered while I waited, unwilling to leave even for a moment, terrified that if I stepped outside that shop the entire conversation might reveal itself as some elaborate misunderstanding. She told me about the years since I'd left, about the brutal first 6 months when she could barely function, about slowly rebuilding herself through the flower shop she'd always dreamed of opening but had never had the courage to pursue while we were together, since our old life had felt too settled, too planned around my career trajectory rather than her own ambitions. She told me, with a directness I both admired and found painful to hear, that leaving her had been cruel regardless of my intentions, that she'd spent over a year genuinely angry at me in ways she'd never fully expressed to anyone, including Persimmon, because expressing that anger felt like admitting how deeply I'd actually mattered. But she also told me something I hadn't expected to hear, something that reshaped everything I'd assumed about the past 3 years, that somewhere in the second year after I left, her anger had slowly transformed into something closer to grief, and her grief had eventually settled into a strange, persistent hope she'd never quite managed to extinguish despite genuinely trying. She'd dated occasionally, much as I had, relationships that never progressed very far because she found herself, much like me, comparing every man she met to someone she'd claimed to be furious with. She admitted, with a small, embarrassed laugh that broke some of the tension between us, that she'd nearly convinced herself this persistent hope was simply an unhealthy attachment to an idealized memory rather than anything real, until Persimmon had mentioned, almost in passing during a recent visit, that I'd seemed unmoored and unsettled during our father's birthday celebration, unable to fully explain why. I told her everything in return, the 3 years of professional success that had felt increasingly hollow, the relationships I'd started and ended because none of them ever felt like more than a distraction from a mistake I'd never properly reckoned with, the mother who never said, "I told you so," but whose silence spoke volumes every time Wilhelmina's name came up in conversation. I told her honestly that leaving had been the single worst decision I'd ever made, not because the career opportunity itself had been wrong to pursue, but because I convinced myself that pursuing it required abandoning the person who mattered more than any professional achievement I'd since accumulated. I apologized, finally, for the actual apology I'd rehearsed for weeks, though by the time I delivered it, sitting across from her in that small, flower-filled shop, it felt considerably smaller and less adequate than the moment actually required. Wilhelmina didn't offer easy forgiveness that afternoon, and I didn't expect her to. She told me, with the same directness that had always been one of the qualities I loved most about her, that rebuilding trust after what I'd done would take considerably more than one afternoon of honest conversation, regardless of how much both of us might want it to be simpler than that. She said she needed time to understand whether what she felt was genuine renewed hope or simply the comfortable pull of nostalgia, and that I needed to prove, through consistent action rather than a single dramatic gesture, that I wouldn't disappear again the moment life became complicated or demanding. Before this story ends, if it moved you even a little, please comment the word hope below, because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is return to a door we were too afraid to walk back through, even when we have no guarantee of what waits on the other side. I extended my vacation time twice over the following month, eventually taking an unpaid leave of absence from my firm entirely when it became clear that whatever was happening between Wilhelmina and me required more than a 2-week visit to properly navigate. I found a small rental apartment 3 blocks from her shop, close enough to be genuinely present without crowding the careful boundaries she'd established, and spent that month rebuilding, slowly and deliberately, the trust I'd shattered 3 years earlier. I helped at the flower shop when she needed extra hands during busy weekends, learning to identify varieties of flowers I'd never known existed, discovering an unexpected satisfaction in the quiet, practical work of arranging bouquets alongside her. I attended Sunday dinners with her family again, sitting in the seat that had apparently remained empty for 3 years, watching her mother's careful, cautious warmth toward me slowly thaw as the weeks passed and I continued showing up consistently rather than disappearing again at the first sign of difficulty. Persimmon, watching all of this unfold with a mixture of relief and lingering wariness, eventually admitted to me privately that she'd never fully believed I would actually follow through once I saw Wilhelmina again, that she'd expected me to retreat back to my old life within days once the initial emotional intensity faded. I understood her skepticism completely, having given her every reason over the previous 3 years to doubt my staying power when circumstances became genuinely difficult rather than simply romantically compelling. 6 months after that first afternoon in her flower shop, I made the decision to formally resign from my firm and accept a position with a smaller engineering company in my hometown, a decision that came with a meaningful pay cut and considerably less prestige than the career I'd spent 3 years building elsewhere. Wilhelmina, when I told her, asked carefully whether I was certain, whether I might eventually resent the sacrifice the way I'd once implied our old life together had felt limiting to my ambitions. I told her honestly that I finally understood the difference between building a life around professional achievement and building a life around the people who actually made that achievement feel meaningful in the first place, a distinction I'd been too immature and too frightened to properly grasp 3 years earlier. We married 18 months after I walked back through the door of her flower shop, a modest ceremony held in the small garden behind her parents' house, surrounded by flowers she'd grown and arranged herself, refusing any assistance from outside vendors for what she called, with a smile I'd once feared I would never see directed at me again, the one arrangement she'd waited 3 years to finally get right. My mother cried through the entire ceremony, and for once, her silence about everything that had happened over the previous 4 years felt like relief rather than restrained judgment. I think often about the 10 minutes I spent standing outside her shop, paralyzed by fear and rehearsed apologies that ultimately mattered far less than simply showing up and telling the truth. I think about how easily I could have turned around, could have convinced myself that too much time had passed, that whatever we'd once shared had certainly dissolved into something unrecoverable. Instead, I walked through a door I'd spent 3 years too afraid to approach, and found a woman who had quietly, stubbornly kept a seat empty at her family's table, waiting not out of naive hope but out of a genuine, patient belief that some things, if they're real enough, are worth waiting for even when waiting costs far more than anyone should reasonably be asked to give. What I thought would be the hardest conversation of my life instead became the exact moment my entire future rewrote itself, proving that sometimes the courage required to walk back through a door we closed ourselves is the only thing standing between us and the life we were always meant to have.